Imagine a workplace with no managers, no job titles, nobody telling you what to do. It sounds amazing, right? It's kind of the modern corporate dream. But what happens when that dream becomes a reality? A really, really rigidly enforced reality. Today, we're going to dive into the surprising truth about bossless companies, and we're going to start with one of the most famous business experiments of our time.
Okay, let's start with just a number. $5,000. What in the world does this have to do with a workplace with no bosses? Well, it all starts at a company that became absolutely legendary for its culture and for a very, very unusual offer.
Yeah, you heard that right. This is exactly what the online shoe retailer Zappos famously did. They'd offer new hires $5,000 at the end of their training to just leave. They literally paid people to quit. It sounds nuts, but it was actually a brilliant way to make sure that only the people who were truly 100% committed would stick around. And believe me, their way of working was unique.
See, long before Zappos got famous for this radical management experiment, it was already famous for its culture. The whole mission from the CEO, Tony Hsieh, was simple. The entire company should be built around one thing: delivering happiness. And this is how they did it. One of their core values was literally to create fun and a little weirdness. Their customer service reps had no time limits on calls. They were just encouraged to connect. In fact, one famous call lasted over 10 hours. And get this, any employee could just give a colleague a $50 bonus on the spot for doing a great job. It was human, it was authentic, and honestly, it really worked.
But then, in 2013, Zappos announced a change that would put all of that at risk. It was a top-down decision from the CEO, Tony Hsieh. He declared that the company was going to adopt Holacracy, a super complex, really rigid operating system with no formal managers. None.
So you have to ask, why? Why would a company that was so famous for its amazing human culture risk it all on a change like this? Well, the goal was to solve a classic problem. See, as companies get bigger, they usually get slower and less creative. Hsieh wanted Zappos to scale more like a city, which actually gets more productive the bigger it gets, not like a corporation that gets bogged down in bureaucracy. Holacracy was supposed to be the magic bullet, but the reality on the ground, a very different story.
And you can just feel the pressure in this quote from an employee at the time. This wasn't just some internal shuffle, it was a public spectacle. The whole world was watching. And because of that, employees felt like they couldn't be honest about their doubts because this experiment had to work. And this quote, this one just nails the core problem. Holacracy promised to get rid of hierarchy, but it didn't. All it did was make the hierarchy invisible. The old power structures, the cliques, the influential people, they didn't just vanish. They just went underground, where everything became unofficial and totally unaccountable. And here's the real kicker. In this last quote, you can feel the heartbreaking irony. That whole fun and a little weirdness that defines Zappos, it was now being choked out by the very system that was supposed to make things better. You had employees literally fighting just to make this rigid, mechanical system feel a little more human again, to save the culture they loved.
So here's the bottom line. Zappos tried to force this single, rigid, one-size-fits-all model onto a really complex and diverse company. And sure, for some departments like finance, it kind of worked okay. But for the creative teams, the folks in IT and development, they hated it. They felt totally stifled by all the new rules and rigid processes. Now, the Zappos story is just a fascinating, powerful case study, right? But it's part of a much bigger debate that's been going on for years. So let's zoom out for a second and look at the actual theory behind these different ways of organizing a company.
Okay, so you basically have two main types. On one hand, you've got the traditional tall organization, the classic pyramid with lots and lots of layers of middle management. And on the other, you have a flat structure where the path from the person on the front line to the person at the very top is much, much shorter. The whole idea is to make communication faster and decisions quicker. But of course, there are trade-offs. Let's break it down. On the upside, flat structures promise faster decisions, they give people more autonomy, and communication is supposed to be way better. That's the dream. But the downside, well, it can create a ton of confusion about who's supposed to do what, there aren't many opportunities for promotion, and just like we saw at Zappos, it can lead to these hidden, unofficial power struggles. And this brings us to this really fascinating idea from back in the 1970s that just perfectly explains why so many of these leaderless groups end up failing.
It's called the tyranny of structurelessness, and it is absolutely key to understanding the whole paradox of bossless companies.
So let's just ask the big question here. If you get rid of the formal bosses, does that mean that power and hierarchy just disappear? Well, according to the feminist author Jo Freeman, who coined that term, the answer is a huge, resounding no.
And here's what she meant. When you get rid of formal structures, you don't actually eliminate hierarchy. You just create a power vacuum, and that vacuum gets filled fast. It gets filled by informal hierarchies, hidden ones, based on things like charisma or popularity or who your friends are. And these hidden power structures can be way more toxic than an open one because they're not acknowledged and there's no way to hold them accountable.
And this brings us to what might be the most important distinction in this whole conversation. Getting rid of bosses, people with positional authority, is not the same thing as getting rid of leadership. A boss has power because of their title, but leadership, that's a function. It's a service that helps a group get things done. Real leadership isn't about ordering people around. It's based on consent that's granted by the group. So the big takeaway is simple. You might not need a boss, but you always need leadership.
So, where does all this leave us? Is the choice really just between a rigid, soul-crushing pyramid and a totally chaotic free-for-all? Well, the good news is the answer seems to be no. So let's get to our final section and see what the future might actually look like.
The real answer, it seems, isn't flat versus tall. It's not an either-or. The most innovative companies out there right now are creating hybrid structures. They're blending the best of both worlds. So they might have really flat, autonomous teams for creative projects, but maybe clearer, more traditional hierarchies for things like operations, blending that freedom with accountability right where it's needed most. So, what have we learned from all this? What are the big takeaways? First, there is no magic bullet, no one-size-fits-all model. What works for one team can totally fail for another. Second, a company's structure has to be adaptable. It needs to be able to evolve as the company grows and changes. And third, maybe most important of all, leadership is a function, not a title. The real goal isn't to just blow up all hierarchy. It's to build systems that have clear roles and real accountability, systems that are based on consent from the people who are actually doing the work. Which really just leaves us with one final big question to think about. The story of Zappos and this whole debate about flat hierarchies, it really forces us to look at our own work lives and ask something fundamental. Is the system you work in designed purely for efficiency, or is it designed for the humans inside of it? The answer to that question might just tell you everything you need to know about the future of work.